a duke who had not smiled in 3 years, wagered his entire ancestral library on a single game of chess, certain he could not lose. He was wrong. By dawn he would lose everything he thought he owned, and call it, without irony, the finest defeat of his life. The candles in the library at Ashworth Hall had burned low, and still neither player moved to end the game, though only one of them understood yet what was truly being staked. Across the board sat Julian Farrow, 7th Duke of Ashworth, his cravat loosened, his eyes rimmed with the particular hollowness of a man who had stopped sleeping properly some 3 years before, and had simply forgotten how to stop not sleeping. Opposite him, in a gown gone soft at the seams from repeated mending, sat Miss Eleanor Ward, companion to his aunt, her hands folded with a stillness that gave away nothing of the calculation running behind her eyes. The fire had burned to embers. The clock on the mantel, one of the few objects in the house still permitted to be wound, ticked toward 1 in the morning. It was the Duke who had proposed the wager, half in scorn, half in the reckless boredom of a man who no longer believed anything could touch him. If he won, she was to say nothing further of shrouded rooms or shuttered gardens, was to leave him to his silence as she had, until recently, always done. If she won, and here he had actually laughed, a short, rusted sound, as though the muscles for it had gone unused, if by some accident she won, he would reopen the house, all of it, the library, the west wing, the nursery no one spoke of. He had said it lightly, the way a man offers a coin toss over a bill he intends to pay regardless, because it had not once occurred to him that he might lose to a paid companion who spent her evenings, he assumed, mending linens and reading psalms aloud to his aunt. He did not know that she had learned this game at her father's knee before her father's debts had learned her, that she had played it alone by candlelight for 11 years, the way other women kept diaries, confessing nothing to anyone but 32 carved pieces and herself. He did not know, sitting there with his ancestral library staked against a woman's quiet request, that he simply live again, that he had already lost, not the game, not yet, something larger and considerably harder to win back. Before we go further, a word to you, settled in wherever you are tonight. If you enjoy a slow burn story where the quiet ones win in the end, where patience does more damage to pride than any shouting match ever could, you are in the right place, and I hope you will stay a while. Consider subscribing before we continue, so that you do not lose the thread of what happens after the candles gutter low over that chessboard. This is a tale of a governor's companion who outthought a duke, not with cunning, not with schemes, but with the plain, unglamorous discipline of doing a small thing well for a very long time until a great man was forced to notice. It is the sort of victory that does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives instead in the folding of a linen napkin correctly for the 1000th time, in the balancing of a household ledger no one thanked her for balancing, in the moving of a single carved knight across a board while a duke who believed himself unteachable watched his certainty erode square by square. You will want to know how she came to be there at all. In that cold, shrouded house, keeping company with an old woman and a grief no one would name. You will want to know how a man so thoroughly convinced of his own numbness came to stake the one thing he claimed still to love, his father's library, his grandfather's library, 3 centuries of leather and gilt and quiet inheritance, on a wager he was certain could not be lost. And you will want to know, I think, what it cost her to win it, because competence of the kind Eleanor Ward possessed is rarely rewarded promptly, and rarely rewarded kindly, and the house she served in was one that had learned, painfully, to punish anyone who dared to feel too much. So settle in. There will be grief in this story, and there will be a steward whose smiles hide something colder than winter, and there will be an old woman with a tongue like a blade who says the true things no one else will say aloud. but there will also be, at the end of it, a library full of sunlight, and a man who finally understands what he wagered and what he won. We will get there together. For now, let us go back before the wager, back before the candle guttered low over 32 carved pieces, to a plain grey morning years earlier, when a young woman with a battered chess set and no family left to speak of, first came walking up the gravel drive of Ashworth Hall, carrying everything she owned in a single trunk, and asking, quietly, if the house had any need of her. Eleanor Ward was 27 when she came to Ashworth Hall, though she had already lived by then several lifetimes of quiet subtraction. She was the only daughter of a country parson who had taught mathematics before he taught scripture, a gentle, exacting man who had shown her, at the age of 6, how a bishop moved on the diagonal and never forgot it, and who had died when she was 19, leaving her a debt-shadowed cottage, a box of his books, and the plain wooden chess set his own father had carved by hand. There had been no mother for a decade by then. There had been no brothers at all. There had been, in short, no one, and a young woman with no one soon learns that the world has very little patience for a woman's grief, and considerably less for her intellect. She had been clever once, sharply, unfashionably clever, the kind of clever that unsettled tutors and delighted her father and made suitors go quiet at dinner. She learned, in the years that followed his death, to fold that cleverness away like a good gown kept for an occasion that never came. She took a post as a governess first, then as a companion again, moving from house to house, the way a coin moves from hand to hand. Useful, unremarked, always slightly worn from handling. She learned to enter a room without disturbing it. She learned to answer a question before it was fully asked, to anticipate a shawl, a headache, a sour mood, to make herself so quietly necessary that no one thought to ask what she herself might need. She learned to smile while letting go. She learned to hide disappointment. She learned never to ask why. It was the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth. Not yet dowager then, merely aunt to a young duke still whole in his happiness, who had hired her, sight almost unseen, on the strength of a single unhurried letter. And it was in the small, plain room given to companions at the top of the east stair that Eleanor set the chess set upon the window-sill each night, its ivory yellowed, its ebony chipped at one rook's crown, and played, by candlelight, against no one at all. She played both sides. She played her father's old openings, the ones he had taught her with his patient forefinger, guiding hers across the board, and she played long into the night sometimes, not because she expected to win against herself, but because it was the 1 hour of the day that belonged entirely to her, unwitnessed, unspent in anyone else's service. If you had asked the household what Miss Ward was like, they would have said capable, and quiet, and kind, and none of them would have known that she could see 6 moves ahead in the dark. Ashworth Hall had not always been a house of shut doors. There had been a time, not so very long before Eleanor's arrival, when its corridors rang with the ordinary noise of a family alive in its own rooms, a child's laughter carrying down the long gallery, a young duchess's voice calling for her husband from the terrace, the click of dice and the shuffle of cards on winter evenings when the whole household, upstairs and down, seemed folded into one warm and breathing thing. That house no longer existed, except in the memories of the older servants, who spoke of it rarely and only in lowered voices, as though loud speech might wake something better left sleeping. The fever that had taken the Duchess and her infant son had come in a single terrible fortnight 3 years past, sweeping through the nursery wing with the indifference of weather, and it had left behind it a husband who did not weep, who did not rage, who simply closed the doors. First the nursery, its rocking horse still facing the window as though waiting for a rider who would never come. Then the west wing, where the Duchess had kept her sitting room, her embroidery frame, her little writing desk with its unfinished letters. Then, last of all and most tellingly, the library, not because it held any particular relic of his wife, but because it had once been the room where he had done his living, his reading, his laughing, his becoming. And he found he could no longer bear to be a man who did any of those things. Sheets went over the furniture like a second grief laid atop the first. Dust settled and was not disturbed. The great house, built for generations of noise, learned instead the discipline of silence, and Julian Farrow, 7th Duke of Ashworth, learned to mistake that silence for peace. He rose at the same hour each day. He took his coffee alone. He reviewed his ledgers with the same grim thoroughness a soldier gives to inspecting his weapons, column after column of rents and yields and repairs, numbers that asked nothing of him and gave nothing back, which was, he had come to believe, the whole point of numbers. He did not attend assemblies. He did not receive callers beyond what business strictly required. He spoke to his aunt in short, courteous sentences that closed every door she tried gently to open, and he had grown so accustomed to the shape of his own numbness that he called it, when he thought of it at all, contentment. He did not know that a house can starve as surely as a man, that rooms left too long unused begin to smell of absence rather than dust, that a heart treated like a debt to be managed rather than a wound to be tended will not heal, it will only go quiet, and mistake its quiet for mending. He did not know it yet. But there was a companion at the top of the east stair who played chess alone by candlelight, and though neither of them could have said why, the house had already begun, very faintly, to hold its breath. It happened on a night of rain, which is to say it happened the way most quiet revolutions do, without ceremony, without witnesses who understood what they were seeing. The Dowager had retired early, with a headache that was not quite a lie and not quite the truth, and had asked Eleanor to fetch a particular book of sermons from the library, the one bound in green calf that soothed her better than any draught. Eleanor went down with a candle cupped against the draught, her shawl pulled tight, thinking of nothing more than green calf bindings and the fastest way back to her own cold room. She did not expect to find the Duke there. He did not expect to be found. He was seated at the small chess table by the window, the one that had not been played upon since his wife's death, a decanter untouched at his elbow and a single lamp burning low, and he looked up at her with the flat, courteous incomprehension of a man interrupted mid-thought about something he could not name. She apologized. He said it was no matter. She reached for the green book on the shelf behind him, and her eye fell, unbidden, on the board between them, a position left mid-game years ago. Dust settled faintly into the black squares, the white king exposed in a way that made her fingers itch. She did not mean to speak. She had spent 9 years learning not to speak unless spoken to, a discipline as automatic as breathing. But her father's voice was in her before she could stop it, patient and dry. "Tell me what you see, Eleanor, not what you feel." And she heard herself say, quite low, that White had blundered 3 moves back, and might yet recover if he saw it. The Duke's head came up slowly. He looked at her the way a man looks at a clock that has struck an hour he did not know existed. Then, without a word, he reset the board and gestured, once to the chair across from him, not an invitation so much as a challenge issued out of pure disbelief that a paid companion should presume to know anything of value. She sat. She should not have. She knew it even as she did it, felt the whole small architecture of her careful invisibility tilt and creak beneath her. But the candle was warm and the rain was steady against the glass, and it had been 11 years since anyone had sat across a board from her as an equal rather than an audience, and some starved part of her simply could not refuse. They played in silence. He played the way he did everything else, correctly, defensively, without joy, a man managing risk rather than seeking beauty, and she matched him for perhaps 20 moves before she saw the opening he had left without knowing it, a small mercy of a mistake, and took it, quietly, without triumph, the way her father had taught her to take anything worth having. Checkmate came softly, almost apologetically. The Duke stared at the board for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, and something moved behind his eyes that had not moved in 3 years, something startled and unguarded, and gone again almost before she could name it. Not warmth, not yet, but the ghost of a question he was not ready to ask. "Good night, Miss Ward," he said, very evenly, rising to close the board himself, as though the click of the box latching shut might also latch something in him. She curtsied and went, her candle guttering, her heart absurdly loud in her own ears. Neither of them spoke of it again for a fortnight. He told himself it had been nothing, a diversion, the idle curiosity of a wet evening, and returned the next morning to his ledgers with the same grim thoroughness as always, certain the crack had already closed. It had not. If the Duke's grief wore the shape of silence, Mr. Josiah Corbyn's ambition wore the shape of civility, and of the two disguises, his was by far the more dangerous, for silence asks nothing of a house, while civility can be made to ask everything. He had come to Ashworth Hall some 9 years before, a steward's son from a lesser estate 2 counties distant, recommended by a solicitor who owed the old Duke a debt he preferred not to discuss, and he had made himself, over the better part of a decade, quietly indispensable. He knew which tenant owed what, which field lay fallow and why, which servant could be trusted with a key, and which could not. He knew, above all, how to smile at exactly the moment a smile would do the most work, a soft, deferential, faintly sorrowful smile that made him seem, to anyone who did not look too closely, the very picture of loyal service. He had smiled that smile at the young Duchess's funeral. He had smiled it, more quietly, at the small white coffin that followed hers a week later, and if there had been calculation beneath the sorrow of that second smile, a private accounting of how much easier a grieving, withdrawn young Duke would be to manage than a happy, watchful one, no one in the church that day had thought to look for it. In the 3 years since, Corbyn had made himself the sole hand at the tiller of Ashworth's affairs, and he had grown fond of the arrangement in the particular way a man grows fond of a room he has quietly rearranged to his own advantage and does not wish anyone else to enter. The ledgers he kept for the Duke's inspection were correct in every particular that mattered, and wrong in a great many that did not. Small sums shaved here, small commissions taken there, the difference always small enough to escape a grieving man's cursory glance, and large enough, over years, to matter a great deal to Josiah Corbyn. He had grown used to being the only one who read the books closely. He had grown used, too, to being the only one whose counsel the Duke sought, the only steady hand in a house of shut doors, and it was this, more than any ledger, that he meant to protect when word first reached him, carried up from the kitchens with the particular relish servants reserve for news that unsettles their betters, that his Grace had sat an hour past midnight in the library, playing chess with the Dowager's plain companion, and had lost. Corbyn received this intelligence with his usual smile. Beneath it, something colder moved, quick and watchful as a man testing ice before he trusts his weight to it, for he understood, before anyone else in the house had troubled to consider it, that a companion who could make the Duke feel something was a companion who might in time make the Duke look, really look, at the books Corbyn kept, and at the man who kept them. Weeks passed, and Ashworth Hall did not change so much as loosen, the way a hand long clenched will loosen finger by finger before it ever thinks to open fully. Eleanor did not press. She had learned long ago, in other houses, under other roofs, that pressing only taught a wounded creature to bolt, and so she went on as she had always gone on, quietly, usefully, asking nothing, noticing everything. She rose before the rest of the house and walked the kitchen garden while the frost was still silver on the cabbage rows, and within a fortnight the beds that had gone to weed since the old head gardener's dismissal were turned and staked and sown again, not because anyone had asked her to do it, but because she could not bear to watch good soil go to waste any more than she could bear to watch her good mind go to waste, and she had rather more opportunity to mend the one than the other. She visited the tenant cottages, with the dowager's basket on her arm, and where she found a leaking roof or a sick child, or an old woman too proud to ask for coal, she did not report it upward and wait for permission. She saw to it, and then, only then, mentioned it in passing, as though it were nothing, as though it were simply what a person did. The tenants began to watch for her at the crossroads. The cook began to set aside the good end of the ham for her tray. The upstairs maids, who had been afraid for 3 years to speak above a whisper in the shut-up corridors, began to hum again when they thought no one was listening, and Eleanor, passing, would smile and say nothing, and let them have their humming. She mended the household accounts too, in her own small corner of it, not Corbyn's great ledgers, which she had not yet thought to question, but the modest domestic books the housekeeper kept, finding here a column added wrong and there a receipt gone missing, and setting each right with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything, never once suggesting that anyone had been careless, only that the sum now agreed. It was, none of it, remarkable in itself. It was only kindness, applied steadily, the way water is applied to stone. But a house remembers kindness the way it remembers cruelty, and the servants at Ashworth Hall had had 3 years of the one and precious little of the other. And they began, in the way of servants everywhere, to compare. Mr. Corbyn, they noticed, was always gracious, always smiling, always ready with a soft word for his grace and a soft word for the dowager. But somehow the tenant whose fence had been broken by the home farm's cattle waited a month for its mending, and somehow the old groom who had served 3 dukes of Ashworth found himself quietly informed that his wages could not, this quarter, be found in the accounts, and somehow it was always Miss Ward, and never Mr. Corbyn, who noticed such things and saw them righted. Corbyn smiled through all of it. He was, everyone agreed, a most obliging man, but he watched her, in the particular way of a man watching a fire he did not light draw closer to a paper he has hidden, and he began, very quietly, to make his own small corrections. Not to the fences or the wages, but to the ledgers, and to the things he said of her, softly, in passing, to anyone who would listen. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth was 71 years old, and she had buried a husband, 2 sons, and most of her patients for pretence, and what remained of her was a small, upright woman with a spine like a fire-iron and a tongue that had, in her long widowhood, been sharpened rather than softened by grief. She had hired Eleanor on the strength of a single letter. Years before the fever took the young Duchess and the boy, and she had watched, in the 3 years since, her nephew turn from a warm and rather ordinary young man into something carved, something that moved through its own house like a guest who had overstayed a morning call and did not know how to leave. She loved him. She had never once told him so, because she considered declarations of that kind to be for people with more time to waste than she had. But she loved him, and it was for that reason, and no other, that she began to watch Miss Ward. She was not a fool, whatever else she was. She noticed that her nephew came later to his ledgers on the evenings Eleanor had been in the library. She noticed that he asked, twice now, whether Miss Ward might be sent to fetch a particular book herself rather than a footman, when a footman would have done as well. She noticed, above all, the fortnight of silence that had followed some private business between the two of them that neither would name, and the way her nephew's jaw had gone tight and pleased and furious all at once whenever the subject of chess arose at the dinner table, which it did, now, with a frequency that struck her as significant. She said nothing of it for some weeks, in the manner of a general withholding fire until the range is certain. Then, one evening over cards, with Eleanor sent early to bed, and the Duke sitting silent over his hand, as he sat silent over everything, she set her own cards down, and said, without preamble, "You have lost a game to your aunt's companion." It was not a question. The Duke said, carefully, that he had lost one game, some weeks past, and did not see what bearing it had on anything. "It has this bearing," said the Dowager, "that I have watched you lose a wife and a son, and your colour, and your appetite, and your good humour, and, I had begun to fear, your wits, and in 3 years I have not once seen you look as thoroughly alive as you did the evening you lost that game." The Duke said, stiffly, that he had not looked any particular way. "You looked," said his aunt, like a man who has been told, against his will, that he is not yet dead. "It did not appear to agree with you at the time. I should like to know whether it has begun to." He did not answer her. She had not, in truth, expected him to. She had buried enough Ashworth men to know that they answered nothing directly if a sideways silence would serve. And she let the silence sit between them like a third player at the table, patient and waiting, and entirely unfooled. It was 3 weeks after that conversation, and past 10 in the evening, when the Duke found Eleanor again in the library, this time by design rather than accident, though he would not have called it design if pressed. She had come, as she often did now, to return a book of the Dowager's, and he had been sitting at the chess table with the pieces already set. As though the room itself had been waiting for her, he did not rise. He said only, "You play a passable game, Miss Ward." Eleanor, who had learned long ago that a compliment from a proud man is often the opening move of an argument, said nothing, and set the returned book upon the shelf, and turned to go. "Sit down," he said. It was not unkind, but it was not a request either, and she sat, because 11 years of service had taught her when a thing was truly a choice, and when it was merely dressed as one. He turned the board so the white pieces faced her, an old courtesy, and said, "I find I have thought of that game more than a man ought to think of a game he lost to his aunt's companion." "You said as much would not happen, your Grace," said Eleanor, and there was, beneath the demureness, the faintest thread of dryness, which he heard, and which unsettled him more than he liked. "I said many things," he said, "in a year when I said very little that I meant." He looked at the board a moment, at the black king in its corner, untouched. "I propose a wager." Eleanor's hands went still in her lap. "A wager, your Grace. You will play me. One game. If I win, you will cease speaking to me of the library, and the West Wing, and the nursery, and all the rest of it, and you will never raise the subject again so long as you remain under this roof." He said it lightly, as a man says a thing he believes costs him nothing, for he was certain as he had been certain of anything in 3 years, that he would win. He had studied since their first match, alone, at night, with the ledgers pushed aside, though he had told no one, least of all himself, why. "And if I win," said Eleanor quietly, "your Grace will open the house. The library, the West Wing, the nursery, all of it, aired and dusted and lived in again." "You are very confident," he said, "for a woman about to lose her one great cause." "I am very confident," she said, "for a woman who has played you before." He almost smiled. It was, she thought, the nearest thing to a smile she had yet seen cross that grieving, guarded face, and it frightened her rather more than his sternness ever had, because it suggested a man still capable of wanting something. And wanting was, in that house, a dangerous and unrehearsed art. "Done then," he said, and put out his hand, as if she were a tenant farmer settling a boundary dispute rather than a companion staking her whole quiet campaign of small kindnesses against his whole shuttered grief. Eleanor took it. Her hand was steady, his was not, quite, though neither of them remarked upon it, and the candle between them guttered once, as candles will, before it burned on straight and clear, indifferent to what it had just witnessed. Now, before we return to that library and watch two stubborn people push wooden pieces across a board as though the fate of a household depended upon it, because, in fact, it did. Let us pause here for a moment, you and I. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with it, rather than let it pass by, the way one lets a church bell pass by on a Sunday morning. Heard but not felt. Which is harder to defeat, pride or grief? Think on the Duke of Ashworth for a moment. His grief is plain enough, is it not? A wife in the ground, a son who never lived long enough to be weaned, a house gone silent as a held breath for 3 years running. Grief like that could excuse a man almost anything, his coldness, his shuttered rooms, his refusal to so much as walk past the nursery door. We forgive grief. We are taught to forgive grief, because it asks nothing of us but patience and a decent silence. But pride is a subtler thing, isn't it? Pride does not announce itself with black crape and drawn curtains. Pride sits very still at a card table and calls itself composure. Pride shakes a companion's hand over a wager it fully expects to win, and mistakes its own certainty for strength, when in truth it is only fear wearing strength's clothing. I think, myself, that grief is the wound, and pride is the scar tissue that grows over it wrong, thick and shiny, and numb to the touch, so that a man may go years believing himself healed when he has only stopped feeling altogether. Which do you think Eleanor is truly playing against, across that chessboard, the grief or the pride that has grown up around it like ivy round a locked gate? I'd love to hear what you think. Leave it below. Tell me your own besetting sin. Tell me whether you've ever mistaken numbness for peace the way this Duke has, 3 long years running. And if you're enjoying this quiet, stubborn little war of theirs, do stay a moment longer, follow along, subscribe if you haven't. Because I promise you the game itself is coming, move by patient move, and it is not the sort of match either of them will walk away from unchanged. Now, back to the library, where the candles are burning low, and the board is set, and a duke who has not wanted anything in 3 years is about to discover that wanting was never actually gone from him at all, only locked away, like every other room in that house, waiting for someone patient enough to turn the key. The clock on the mantel struck the half-hour, and neither of them moved to acknowledge it. The library was cold with disuse, warmed only by the fire Eleanor had asked a footman to lay, and by the 2 candles burning low between them on the small table where the board sat waiting, white for the Duke, black for her. He had insisted upon it, the courtesy of first move, as though courtesy were a thing he still possessed in abundance and could afford to spend. She had accepted without comment. She always accepted without comment. It was, she privately thought, her besetting sin, this endless willingness to let a room believe itself in command of her, when in fact she had already counted every door in it. He opened with his pawn to the center of the board, a plain and honest move, the sort a confident man makes when he does not yet know he is afraid. She answered him in kind, pawn to pawn, a small, quiet mirror. He looked up at her over the candlelight, and for the first time in 3 years, something like curiosity moved behind his eyes, quickly suppressed, quickly filed away under the heading of nothing at all. He advanced his knight. She matched it, unhurried, her hands folded in her lap between moves the way her father had taught her. Never touch a piece until you mean it. Eleanor, a woman who fidgets at the board, has already told her opponent she is afraid. She was not afraid. He was. It was there in the stiffness of his shoulders. In the too careful way he set each piece down, as though the board itself might shatter if he pressed too hard, as though feeling anything, even triumph, was a risk he had not budgeted for in 3 years of ledgers and silence. 10 moves passed in near total quiet, broken only by the settling of the fire and the small, decisive click of ivory on wood. He castled early, tucking his king behind a wall of pawns, safe, guarded, exactly as he had tucked himself behind 3 years of shut doors and unread correspondence. She noted it. She did not smile. 15 moves. He advanced a bishop with something almost like aggression, a flicker of the man he must once have been before the fever took his wife and son in a single terrible fortnight. And she met the advance not with retreat, but with a small, unlooked-for sacrifice, a pawn, offered plainly, undefended. He hesitated over it. She watched him hesitate. A man who has stopped wanting things does not know what to do when something is simply given to him. He took the pawn. Of course he took it. He had spent 3 years believing that taking was safer than giving. That certainty was safer than hope, and she had built her whole quiet strategy on precisely that belief. 20 moves. His queen came forward, bold, almost desperate, seeking the kind of decisive strike that ends a match in one clean stroke. The way he had once perhaps believed grief itself might be ended in one clean stroke of will. It was not enough. She brought her own pieces round in a slow, patient net. Not fast, never fast. Patience had been the whole of her education, in chess and in life alike, until his king stood cornered behind the very wall he had built to protect it, with nowhere left to retreat, no square unwatched, no door unlocked. 23 moves. She moved her rook the final small distance, set it down without ceremony, and folded her hands again in her lap. "Check," she said quietly. And then, a breath later, watching his eyes travel the board and find, at last, that there was truly nowhere left to go. "Checkmate, Your Grace." The news of the wager's outcome could not, of course, remain a matter between 2 people alone in a candlelit library. Ashworth Hall was a house of many ears even in its grief, and by the second morning the servants' hall knew that the Duke had lost, and lost fairly, and had risen from the table and bowed to Miss Ward as though she were royalty rather than his aunt's paid companion. Mrs. Fenimore the cook said it was the first true smile she had seen cross the housekeeper's face in 3 years. The footman said it more plainly still, in the way footmen always do, over their supper, that something in the house had shifted, like a window opened after a long-sealed winter. It was into this shifting air that Mr. Corbin walked one grey forenoon, summoned, he believed, to review the quarter's accounts with the Duke, as he had done unchallenged for 3 years running, and found instead the great hall filled with faces he had not expected to see gathered, the housekeeper, the head groom, 2 tenant farmers from the home farm, the Dowager Duchess seated very upright in the chair nearest the fire, and Eleanor Ward standing quietly at the long table, with a stack of ledgers before her, her hands folded, her face composed in the manner he had long mistaken for meekness, and had never once mistaken for danger. He smiled, because smiling had always served him. It was the same soft, gracious smile he had worn at every rent day and every audit for a decade. The smile that had made him beloved of the neighborhood and invisible to suspicion. "Your Grace," he said, "I did not know we were to have company for the accounts." The Duke did not smile back. He had spent a night beside a chessboard, learning what it cost to lose honestly, and he had no further appetite for men who had spent years winning dishonestly. "Sit down, Corbin," he said, and the 2 words carried more weight than any speech. Eleanor opened the first ledger. She had spent the small hours of 3 weeks matching the steward's careful entries against the tenants' own accounts of what they had paid and what they had received, against the miller's receipts and the home farm's tallies, against the simple arithmetic that does not lie even when the hand recording it does. "Here," she said, and her finger did not tremble, is the rent collected from the Hollis farm in Michaelmas, entered as £11. Here is Mr. Hollis's receipt, showing 13. The difference, multiplied across 4 years and 11 tenancies, does not vanish. Misty, Corbin, it accumulates. It was, she added, quietly, the same as your whispers about me to the housekeeper. Small enough, each one, to be denied. Large enough, together, to do harm. The room was very still. Corbin's smile did not leave his face all at once. It merely stopped reaching his eyes, then stopped reaching anywhere at all, until what remained was only the shape of a smile, with nothing behind it. A mask discovered mid-performance, with the curtain already risen. The Duke did not raise his voice. That, more than anything, was what the household would remember and repeat for years afterward in the kitchen and the stable yard and over garden walls to neighbouring parishes, that the Duke of Ashworth, confronted with 4 years of theft dressed as diligence, did not shout. He simply closed the ledger under his palm, the way a man closes a door on a room he does not intend to enter again, and said, "You have taken bread from tenants who trust this house to deal honestly with them. You have taken more than bread. You have taken their faith. There is no arithmetic that restores that, Corbin, though I think you understood the arithmetic well enough when it served you." Corbin's mouth opened, some practiced defence rising by old habit, some smooth phrase about misunderstandings and the burdens of an unsupervised steward's ledger, and the Duke lifted one hand, not unkindly, and the words died before they reached air. "I am not interested in your explanations," he said. "I am interested in what is owed. You will return what can be traced. You will leave Ashworth Hall by week's end. You will not be given a character reference, but neither will I have you prosecuted, though I have the grounds and you know it. Consider that mercy, and do not mistake it for forgiveness." Corbin's face, drained now of every practised pleasantness, went the colour of old tallow. He looked once at Eleanor, and something passed there that was not quite hatred and not quite shame, some smaller, meaner thing that had no name, and then he looked away and said nothing at all, for there was nothing left to say that would not sound like begging, and pride, even ruined pride, would not permit that. The Dowager Duchess, who had watched the entire proceeding with her hands folded atop her cane, like a woman at the theatre confident of the ending, allowed herself one dry observation into the silence. "Well," she said, "that is the most interesting quarterly review this house has seen in 30 years. Do sit down, the rest of you, before someone faints from the drama of it." It was, in its small way, a mercy of its own, that laugh startled loose from Mrs. Fenimore and quickly smothered, the tension in the room easing by half a degree. But the Duke was not finished. He turned next to the housekeeper, to the 2 under-footmen who had carried tales for Corbin without asking why, and his voice gentled considerably. "You believed what you were told," he said. "That is not the same as wickedness. You will keep your places, and I will thank you to earn back what trust was spent carelessly, not through punishment, but through plain service, which I think you are capable of." Relief moved through that portion of the room like sun through cloud. And then, last, he turned to Eleanor, and the great hall, which had been so full of reckoning, went hushed in a different way entirely. Waiting. The morning the dust sheets came off the library, it rained, softly, the ordinary rain of an ordinary day, as though the sky itself had decided that grand weather was no longer required for grand changes. Eleanor stood in the doorway, with the cloth still in her hand, not because she meant to work, but because old habits do not leave a person merely because their circumstances have. 2 footmen drew the great linen shrouds from the shelves in long, sighing sweeps, and the books beneath them stood revealed exactly as they had been left years before, spines uncracked, a pair of spectacles folded on a low table where the late Duchess had set them down one evening and never returned to pick them up, Nobody moved to hide that small relic away. The Duke had asked, quietly, that it remain exactly where it was, a fact rather than a wound, and Eleanor had understood without needing the explanation that this was what healing looked like in a house like this one, not the erasing of grief, but the making of room beside it for something else to live. Sunlight came through the tall windows in slow gold bars, catching the motes of old dust still drifting down like a kind of blessing, and fell across the long table by the hearth where that same afternoon the Duke himself set down a small battered chess set with his own hands, no longer hidden in a governess's basket, no longer confined to candlelight and closed doors, but placed there openly, in full daylight, for anyone in the house to see. It was, of everything that had happened, the detail Mrs. Fenimore would repeat most often below stairs in the weeks that followed, that His Grace had carried it himself. He found Eleanor there among the shelves that evening, the fire lit at last after years of cold grates, and he did not begin with apology, because they had already spent that between them. He began instead with the plain truth he had apparently been assembling, piece by piece, the way she once assembled a ledger. "I told you once that I had made my peace with an empty house," he said. "I was wrong. It was not peace. It was only silence, and I had simply stopped noticing the difference. You noticed it for me." He crossed the room to stand before her, and there was nothing numb left in his face at all. "I love you," he said plainly, the way he might have once stated a fact of business, except that his voice caught faintly on the word love, as though he had not used it aloud in so long he had nearly forgotten its shape in his mouth. "I do not offer you a wager this time, Eleanor. I have nothing left to stake that you have not already won." She looked at him a long moment, this quiet man who had once mistaken grief for peace and pride for strength, and she said, simply, "I know." And then, because some truths deserve to be spoken twice, she said it again, so that neither of them could mistake it for anything less than certain, "I love you too." Outside, the rain went on falling, soft and unremarkable, exactly the kind of evening that asks nothing of history, and gets, none the less, all of it. And if you have stayed with this story to its end, thank you truly for sitting with Eleanor and her Duke through every closed door and quiet defeat along the way. Tell me down in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and whether you think pride or grief was the harder thing for him to lose. I will be back soon with another tale worth staying up for. Good night.